Hi, I'm Dean Foster, author of the Global Etiquette Guides and Bargaining Across Borders, and I'm here in London speaking at the Forum for Expatriate Management, and we'll be talking about developing culturally competent organizations and the importance of understanding cultural differences when working around the world. Come join me at the conference presentation right now. And welcome everyone. As you can see here up on the screen, we had creating the culturally competent company, which sounded like a mouthful to say. And given the circumstances in my country at this very moment, I was about to actually think of talking about the culturally competent country and how do we make that happen. But I think we'll stick to the topic here at hand, which is making the culturally competent organization. And as some of you may know, for the last almost 30 years, I've been involved in developing cultural competency both for the end user, the expats, the families that are being relocated from one location to another, as well as creating the culturally competent company, the organization that needs to be working in these other areas outside of their home country. So today, I'd like to explore what makes a culturally competent company, an organization, as well as what makes the individuals in that organization culturally competent. And to start off, I have two questions that I'd like to let you folks think about with each other for about 30 seconds. Turn to the person next to you, each of you, and share in your partnership an answer to these questions. Can you identify one event at work where you learned that the way you do things here has to be done differently over there? And what did you have to do to change the way you worked successfully over there? And I think you also identified a very important aspect about becoming culturally competent. And that is, we have to go through 3 steps, in fact. We have to become aware of the fact that cultural competency is on the table. It is an issue in the 21st century world. There is no room for cultural ignorance anymore. In the 21st century, we have to manage cultural differences. So there's this first stage of awareness. The second stage is understanding why these differences exist. What is it about Spain that makes for a more conceptual orientation? What is it about the UK that makes for an end result orientation? And when we understand the reasons for these differences, we can go on to the third stage. And the third stage is, what do I do about it? What kind of strategies can I put in place to manage these differences? The good news is that there are best practices that we've come up with, that we've created, that others have researched, that enable us to bridge these differences in very effective ways. The bad news is that if you go about it looking to change the other, it will be a long and hard slog. So it's not about changing them or the other, but rather it is about managing your response to these very objective, factual differences in culture that are now on the table that need to be managed. And that process is effective cultural competency development. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that and how do we get through that process. And when we talk about culture, of course, we like to begin by taking a look at this quote, which takes us back. This is not a new idea of developing cultural competency. The ancient Chinese, 2,500 years ago, understood the critical competency skill required when working with people of other cultures. This is a quote from the Liga, one of Confucius' 5 great classic works, who reminds us that when we enter another region and work with people who are different from ourselves, we must manage these differences successfully. Now, in today's global world, it's not so simple as 2,500 years ago. Most individuals today working in a particular location are actually working on global teams. So if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are relocated from London to Shanghai, not only do they have to understand how to live and work in a Chinese environment, not only must they understand how to work with the Chinese associates that they are working with on a daily basis, but they also must understand what it means to work with people from 25 other nationalities every day, because they're probably working on global teams. This is the nature of the world today. And so we have to train people to the development of a global mindset, to be culturally agile, in addition to understanding the facts that exist between themselves and, in the example I just gave, China. This is a complicated task. And again, the question that I hope we can get to by the end of our session today is how do we do this? But let's move on. Okay, so what makes a global company? How do we define it? What does this beast look like, right? Well, in general, I'd like to summarize it with three statements. It's a company where headquarters sets the global strategies that are based on local best practices everywhere. That's the role of headquarters, to establish the best practices that are then going to be put into place everywhere. Second, where headquarters brokers these best practices to the rest of the organization everywhere, so that everyone learns what these best practices are. And where continuous support is given after this process is in place, so that everyone can hone these skills and become very, very good at them. Now, let's illustrate this a little bit. You know, someone once said that a global company really, fundamentally, is a local company everywhere. The ability to be local and yet achieve the headquarters global strategy. Global strategy with local tactics. Now, when an organization first starts out on this journey, let's say we've been a domestic company and now we want to work internationally, usually the first step, the intuitive step, is to do what we do best here over there. And that usually marks the beginning of an international perspective, not a global perspective, but an international perspective. Let's export the way we do it here, because we know very well what works here. Let's do the same thing over there. But very quickly we discover that the way we do it here needs to be adapted to the local realities over there. And so that takes us to this next step of acknowledging local differences. So headquarters' responsibilities and tasks is really to take these global strategies. The strategy is the same everywhere. We want to achieve globally XYZ. But how do we do it? We have to do it according to local requirements. And the third step, and I would say this is the development going from an international company to a global company to a transnational company. This third step is getting feedback from all of the locations everywhere around the world, and headquarters brokering this information about how to do things successfully, differently everywhere, and brokering this information throughout the entire organization so that everyone learns these best practices. In fact, headquarters becomes informed of these best practices. So the way we do it in London has to be done a little differently when we go to Kuwait. The strategy can be the same, but the way we achieve that goal in Kuwait has to be a little bit different. And maybe that the way that we do things in Kuwait isn't so bad. Maybe we can learn from that. Maybe there are parts of the global organization that can actually benefit from knowing how they succeed in Kuwait in achieving global headquarters goals. So let's broker this information. Let's get everybody up to speed on the best practices everywhere. And I guess the rhetorical question that I'd throw out to you folks is, are you working for a company that does this? Does your company share the best practices of all of its parts with all of its parts? That's the role of headquarters in a transnational organization. And headquarters kind of almost becomes invisible in this role, because they themselves are being informed of these best practices and changing their global strategy accordingly. Now, that's the organization. What about the individuals in the organization? These global managers that have to implement these global strategies in different ways in different locations. Well, what makes a global manager? Let's take a look. Some of the skills that have been identified that create competency or a global mindset with the individuals in transnational organizations usually fall into these three categories: language skills, global cultural skills, and post-global awareness. How do I take my skills and make it work in a post-global environment? Language skills, for one. All right, if you succeed in one country, the more you can speak the language of your new location, the better. There is no doubt about it that the language of business is the language of the customer everywhere. So if you can speak Portuguese in Brazil, you have an added advantage. If you're speaking Mandarin in China, you have the advantage. If you're speaking in France, ultimately you must speak French. The language of business is the language of the customer. The language of business is not English. although English has become the global language of communications, which means I can be working for a German organization based in Frankfurt, global organization, but chances are that the language that I'll be using to communicate with all of my colleagues within the organization will be a form of global English, even though some of us might be able to speak the local language in India, in China, in Brazil, in France. Right? So we've got to develop these language skills and be able to understand how to manage global English and also develop some language competencies. We also have to develop the culture competencies. We have to become aware of ourselves as cultural beings. What does it mean to be in my case, from New York City when I work with people elsewhere? How do I manage those differences? How do I employ best practices that work for me as well as for them? And that third stage, post-global awareness, what does it mean to understand these differences in a post-global environment? In other words, it is not enough today to understand Saudi culture as it relates to my culture when working with Ahmed in Riyadh. Because not only is Ahmed a Saudi, and not only does he demonstrate full knowledge of Saudi values and behaviors, but Ahmed is also working and grew up in a post-global environment. So he may have spent his summers at his daddy's flat here in London. He may have gone to UCLA for his advanced degree. He understands many cultures, and he understands how not to be so Saudi when necessary. In Riyadh, he is Saudi. In London, he's global. And the ability to understand this difference and to manage this difference is also a sophisticated skill that's required by managers in today's world. So developing these, therefore, are critical for the success of those global managers because they face some unique paradoxes. As you know, transferees and expats are unique beings with unique challenges. Some of these challenges are that they have to implement those global headquarters strategies, but they have to do so in local environments. They have to function within powerful centripetal and centrifugal global forces. In today's world, things are pulling us apart as well as pulling us together. The environment is changing from a pulling together environment to a pulling apart environment. We see it in the headlines, of course, all the time. Global managers have to manage these powerful forces, and they have to master the soft human skills in order to achieve success on the hard bottom line. Now, in addition to these paradoxes, they have to pursue personal and professional life in a challenging environment that is often geared to less success and less achievement than if they were doing it at home. They have to balance goals and achievements within the realities of limits and failures when working abroad. Now, when we looked at culture, traditionally, we often use the model of thinking about culture, referred to as a cultural iceberg. I remember one time I was speaking about culture in Quito, Ecuador, and I said, think about culture as an iceberg. I'm talking to people who live on the equator, right? Not a relevant metaphor for them. But for our purposes today, so even models of culture, of course, are culturally determined. But for our purposes today, it's a good model to think about the differences and where we need to put our focus when we talk about culture. Like an iceberg, most of culture is invisible. 10% is the visible part. That's the part that we see. That's the explicit culture at the top. But the part that's invisible is underneath the surface. This is 90% of culture. Implicit culture, the part that you do not see, the values and the traditions of a people and the culture. When we work with each other, we're usually only observing the behaviors, not necessarily understanding the values. So oftentimes I get questions like, well, I'm making a trip and when I greet people, what do I do? Do I bow? Do I pick up chopsticks? Do I give them 3 kisses or 2 kisses or no kiss? And the answer is quite simple. You're looking at the tip of the iceberg, the explicit culture. Managing explicit cultural differences is easy. All you have to do is mirror what you see. The hard part is what you don't see. That's the 90% of the cultural values and traditions that have to be explained in order to be understood and managed. And like the Titanic when it was sailing around the global seas, what will sink your ship when you work around these global icebergs is what you do not see. Yep. Now, the behaviors, well, easy examples of different behaviors. You can walk into an office anywhere around the world, and you can see that everyone is having to achieve these things, but they're doing it in different ways. And they're doing it in different ways precisely because of the values that are under the surface that define those differences. Now, those values that are invisible under the surface usually fall into three areas. Area number one, how do we define human relationships? Do groups make decisions or do individuals make decisions? Do we leave decision-making to the top of the hierarchy, or is everyone empowered to participate in the decision-making? Should decisions be made only by certain people based on their gender, age, class, etc.? Or is everyone involved in the process? These different value sets will create different kinds of behaviors in the workplace. Do we value the building of a relationship first in order to achieve the task? Or do we value achieving the task first and then celebrate with a relationship? Essentially, do we go out for a beer in order to get the job done? Or do we get the job done first and then celebrate with a beer? Every culture is going to look at these things in different ways. The second category is going to be around this area of time. These are the invisible values under the surface. And in time, do we manage time or does time manage us? Do we depend on the clock and the calendar and the agenda? Or is that something that is secondary and our human relationships and human needs in the moment what determine when and how we do things? And the third big area, of course, is how do we communicate with each other? Do we communicate in an explicit way or an implicit way? Do we emphasize harmony as a major priority, therefore taking what we have to say and tempering it so that it is not so painful at times? Or do we say everything that needs to be said explicitly, put it on the table, painful or not? In other words, are we direct or are we indirect in the way that we speak with each other? I remember speaking with Tanaka-san one time in Japan, and I said to Tanaka-san, tell me, what do you think of the terms of this agreement? And Tanaka-san said, very interesting. There are many fine things in this agreement. A few things need some further study. Now, as a direct speaker from a culture that values explicit direct speech, you could look at those words and say we're pretty close to a deal. But knowing that Tanaka-san is from Japan, where we value implicit communication, where we value avoidance of confrontation and negativity, what he really told me was that we're very far from a deal. Understanding this difference in how we communicate is critical, especially when all we can communicate with is an email or a telephone on virtual teams. So these are some of the traditional cultural dimensional differences that we have to develop skills for managing in organizations as well as individuals. However, in today's post-global world, in addition, remember we said there were these three areas. In the post-global world, in addition to these traditional cultural differences, we have the reality of Ahmed in Saudi. We have the reality of the development of a global mindset amongst some, not all, individuals. Because in today's global world, there are global forces that are affecting and mediating these very individual cultural icebergs. Now, these global forces can be identified as the movement of populations, the development of popular culture, globalization and all that comes with that, transportation, global transportation, the fact that there are more people today moving around the world than ever before in human history. The question is, are we learning from each other? We may be interacting with each other more than ever before, but does that automatically result in intercultural knowledge and competence? If we look at history, the news is not so good. Cultural interaction at first usually generates suspicion, hostility, misunderstanding. And so the fact that we're increasingly intercultural and interculturally connected and communicating with each other does not ergo mean that we're understanding each other. Over time, that might develop. But initially, most organizations I know don't have time for that to develop. They need the profit now, they need the ROI now, and they certainly don't need the headache of misunderstanding, suspicion, and hostility. They need effective, smooth-working global teams now. Which means that we have to provide the skills for developing that. Just because we're on the phone with our colleagues more often than we were before doesn't mean we understand them any better. So developing these skills becomes critically important. To manage the post-global forces, to manage the traditional cultural forces, and to manage the development of these global managers. Now, an example of the result of this post-global world that I'm speaking of, where the global forces represented by the sun are melting all the icebergs. Everybody here work with Singalandu? You know the culture of Singalandu? I'm sure you're working with Singalandu or Telemum or Panasau. Singalandu, Singapore, London, and Dubai. That culture has more in common with itself and the individuals in that culture in Singapore, London, and Dubai than it has with the country in which those three areas emerged. In other words, London today, as we all know, in fact, has far more in common with Singapore and Dubai in terms of business styles than it has with much of the rest of the country. We have the development and the phenomenon of these global islands in a post-global world, where the skills are more similar between its parts than they are within the countries in which it developed. So in Dubai, it's far more familiar to work in a Singaporean and London way than it is to work in an Arab Peninsula way. And this fundamental development, this phenomenon of the development of global islands, is also matched with this phenomenon of synchronicity, meaning that due to the melting of the icebergs from these global forces, the tips of all the icebergs are kind of looking the same. When the sun shines on an iceberg, it's the top part that melts first. The bottom part stays frozen. So you travel around the world and you get off the plane in Tokyo and in London and in Johannesburg and in Sao Paulo, and it all kind of looks the same in the workplace. We're all in our big air-conditioned offices. We're all kind of dressing alike. We're all using a form of global English. We're all using technology. But what is similar, what has become homogenized, is the tip of the iceberg. The visible part of culture, the easy part. Those global forces haven't changed the fundamental differences, and those fundamental differences at the bottom are what will get you in trouble. So we're living in a very complex post-global environment where we need to have cultural understanding of what makes me different from Ahmed, but I also have to understand what makes Ahmed maybe the same, but only on a superficial level. And fundamentally, his Saudi behavior and his Saudi values are still there and will demonstrate themselves in the workplace. Well, that's a lot to process, I know. And these are big skills that people have to develop. So how do we get there? Well, one way to get there is through a process that I refer to as growing global. And managers can do it, individuals can do it, and organizations must do it. Jack Welch, the former chairman of GE, once said that in the 21st century, the critical determinant of success will be the ability to take your hard skill expertise and cross cultures with it. Those who get it survive in the 21st century, and those who don't fall away. So what does this process look like? Well, it means developing a mindset that goes from the bottom left-hand side of the screen to the top right side of the screen, where people have a global mindset and understand about being culturally agile, where they move from selecting out only the things they like and understand and blaming others for things that don't go right, where they begin to accept and respect differences, ultimately understanding them, and perhaps even selectively using some, where maybe the way they do it in Delhi is a neat solution to my problems here in London. I'm not saying we have to do everything the way it's done elsewhere, but I am saying become aware of it, understand it, and then selectively use what might be appropriate as a tool for solving problems in a new and different way. That's a globally competent organization. Now, who are the audiences for developing global competency, for developing the skill to be able to work across cultures? Well, we know that individual assignees need to do it. Experienced assignees as well as newbies need to do it. We know that managers need to do it. We know that leadership needs to do it because they have to understand cultural differences when developing strategy. Managers have to understand how to work in a post-global environment, implementing this strategy in the local environment that they're in. We know that for example, when we provide cultural training to organizations, the individuals who absolutely demand it, the individuals who want the cultural training, who seek it out, are the ones who've already received it and been on assignment before. The ones who don't understand the value, the ones who question whether or not it's going to be useful, in fact, are those who've never been abroad before. So all audiences in the organization can benefit from developing the global mindset and developing cultural competency. But not everybody needs to develop it quite the same way. And so the process needs to take into consideration these three questions, right? We have to become aware. That was step one, if you recall. We have to then understand, and then we have to be able to implement. What do I do about it? So that I can become immediately implementable best practices for changing my behavior in order to succeed elsewhere. And we can take people through these three steps in different ways, depending on their needs, depending on who they are, their audience, and depending on the level of global mindset that they need to develop. Therefore, these three stages are going to be awareness, can be as simple, we can develop it as simply as providing access to information. Here's a great book on Thailand if you're going to go to Thailand, if you're doing business in Thailand. If all we need to do is develop awareness, then reading something, going through a self-paced training program, talking to someone as a mentor who's been there, can provide some awareness of the fact that there are significant differences. But if the need is greater than just awareness, if it's more than just I'm getting on and off a plane for a week in Bangkok, but perhaps I'm relocating to Bangkok, now we have to understand why these differences exist. And understanding requires more than just reading the book or talking to a stranger or a mentor. Understanding requires talking to an expert and getting some analysis about one's own behavior so that we can start to compare how I would do things versus how we actually do them in Thailand. And this takes us to that third step. What do I do about it? We need to develop real training, coaching, mentoring, putting all the pieces together, accessing information in a process that gives people the knowledge, the skills, and the ability to hone those skills through ongoing coaching, as well as interventional training, as well as access to information. Putting somebody through that kind of process is going to develop the real skills necessary for success in Thailand. So assessing your audience, assessing the level of cultural development, cultural competency that they need to develop, and then providing the intervention that allows them to develop that cultural competency is part of the growing global process. As we say, working around the world from a home-based perspective is international. But working around the world from a world-based perspective is global. And all organizations today need to have that global perspective in order to succeed in the 21st century. Not an easy thing to do, but something that cannot be avoided. And as I said, no wiggle room for ignoring culture anymore. Not when we're working around the world every day. I'm going to leave you with one final thought. And I'm going to ask you to do a final intercultural exercise with me, right? Take your finger, please, and point to the ceiling. And trace a circle going in a clockwise direction. Now let's just move around in that clockwise direction. And now keep pointing to the ceiling, but move your hand down to eye level. Keep pointing to the ceiling, keep moving in that same direction. And now bring your hand below eye level and look at the direction you're going in. counterclockwise. How did that happen? Do you want to do that again? You can go home and show the kids. And point to the ceiling, clockwise direction. Bring your hand down to eye level. Keep moving in that same direction. And now, below eye level, you're going counterclockwise. What happened? Did reality change? What changed? Perspective. How you saw it changed. Reality stayed the same. And when we work across cultures, we're all looking at the same reality, but we're looking at it with different perspectives. And those different perspectives are tools for solving old problems in new and different ways. Cultural differences are, in fact, tools for doing just that. And that's why we must develop cultural competency in the individuals and in the organizations in which we work. Thank you all very much for your time today. I hope it was useful for you.